Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance in this Truth Bomb riff. This is the 723rd episode of these Truth Bombs going back nearly 4 years. It'll be 4 years, I think, in a month. Wow. God, does time fly when you're delivering Truth Bombs? Um, it is January 4th, 2026, if I didn't already mention that. And this is my second Truth Bomb riff of the new year. Yesterday, I was joined by my friend Reagan Boychuk from Alberta, Canada. And boy, did he have a lot of interesting things to say. And I would encourage you to check it out to see the corollaries of pretty much the last 3 centuries and the nature of imperialism and what's playing out right now. But I wanted to address pretty much all of the things that are flying at us because, look, I've never been more sort of confident. I've never been more sort of calm in my demeanor, in my position of where I am in this process. And what I'm telling you, as I do pretty much every time I hit record on these things, I am the producer with the $71 trillion truth. Now, in the description below, and I don't normally do this, but I'm going to do links to a lot of things that I'm going to reference in this hopefully brief truth bomb that I would encourage you all, especially if you're just finding out about me, to delve into, and then you can start getting the composite picture of why what I'm revealing and what I'm pitching here to the country, the Clean New Deal, is truly the only way out of this madness. And I don't take that lightly. It is something that I've spent tens of thousands of hours in a process of aggregating to understand the information that I'm revealing that gives you the full scope response to Project 2025 and all things the billionaire apparatus that's been at work on our democracy with a global cabal for nearly, I don't know, 7 decades. It's pretty much the entirety of the post World War II era that unfortunately took a wrong turn, taking shortcuts based on greed and starting with a slippery slope of unethical behavior that then eventually leads to criminal behavior. And then that leads to ultimately complicity and now conformity in a system that is completely corrupt. And we all see that right in front of our eyes. And so many people are grasping at straws, trying to sort through, well, we've seen this game before. This is the second, third, fourth verse, same as the first. But we still don't know what to do about it because, A, most of us haven't done anything about it because we trust the system. And that's the problem because ignorance is what this system of lies depends on that will then ultimately overwhelm people's capacity to be able to a filter through critically what is and then ultimately arrive at a destination of what could be. But I will say, given all of the sort of doom and gloom that I am imparting, that we're in the midst of, that we all can clearly see, that I know with everything that I am that this is the greatest opportunity in the history of the world to reboot and to create a system of by and for the people, of liberty and justice for all. And of course, since I'm an 80s rock and roll guy, punk rock and all that kind of stuff, and I'll, justify that through my Metallica and justice for all. I went through this recent situation. I think you can only see the top part of it, but kind of like a midlife crisis where I ended up buying a whole lot of T-shirts for my youth. And interestingly enough, when I made my first documentary film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, which again, as I prefaced, I'm going to put in the description below, um, that I decided to wear a lot of punk rock and roll T-shirts during the filming of that documentary to connect with people. Because I do come from, late 70s, early 80s, 90s, and that whole era from rock and roll to punk rock to grunge. And, for all of you who've lived through that, I mean, we've seen each other at shows. We've been there, done that. We've been questioning certain things and being, I don't know, cynical, jaded, this, that, and the other. But it's our generation that's also created this madness, at least on the tech side. Okay. And the guys like Sergey Brin and his partner at Google, whose name eludes me at the moment. Uh, now Schmidt was the CEO. Anyway, and all the tech bros, right? Elon Musk is a couple of years younger than me, and he's worth now close to $1 trillion because of the systemology of the revelation that I have, because I have the $71 trillion truth that makes it all possible. And the nature of the game is such that what we're in the midst of is what I actually understood in the late 90s, which is really incredible to me. And I think that's why my mind is so calm at the moment, because it's the reason I ended up having to go on the journey that I did. And it's a little bit strange in retrospect, but not really. It's just simply because of how I grew up, what the influences were, what was important to me, and ultimately what it leads to. So, for example, I'd already mentioned, going through that sort of rock and roll phase of my life, right? Which had a lot of incredible influence, including Bob Marley and Joe Strummer, if you're familiar with those two. And if you're not, I highly recommend you tap into what they were all about and what they had to say, because that will certainly help you germinate where your mind should be because of all the clutter of the insanity of manipulation and social media. And I really feel so bad for the young guns because they don't really have yet that I've discovered. Maybe they do, and I'm just kind of out of touch. But a sort of centrifugal resistance force that everybody's speaking the same language, where they just know this is all BS and they have to converge together to be able to sort through things. That's how we did it in my age. That's what they did before I came to be, and so on down the line. I mean, it's kind of an American, shall we say, tradition for each generation to push back against the previous generation and kind of hand off the baton to create a new world. But what we did was we got jammed up on money. What we did was we got jammed up on lies. We got jammed up on very sophisticated people that could see the system for what it was, kind of serve two different masters and pretend like they were actually giving the people what they wanted, while at the same time betraying them. And that's not new in human history, as we all know. But at the same time, I think that the United States and our system has taken it to levels really never before seen in terms of maybe execution. And, I think what's important about, well, it's all very important, but, this incursion, this military sort of whatever into Venezuela and what's going to shape up next, was done flawlessly. The United States military's capability is extraordinary. And that's kind of what happens when you spend over $700 billion a year and have a defense force with a budget that's literally larger than the top 12 countries combined for the last 2 decades. And yeah, we have a lot of capacity, but we don't have a lot of commitment to what the military is supposed to be used for. And it's been a slippery slope for a long time. And I think I want to address originally, kind of how this whole thing basically it was a seismic shift. Because in the late 90s, my friends, we were on the path to creating a renewable energy future. There was an opportunity within the confines of the United States economy and the way things work and progress, especially because we just had kind of the tech revolution. And we went through, for example, the tech bubble, and the way it was all sorted out at that time was, yeah, Wall Street and investors are going to bet on a lot of different potential scenarios. And then there's going to be the victors. And that's what happened. And the victors turned out to be this tech oligopoly. Is that the word? That make up the Googles and the Apples and the so on and so forth, and Microsoft and whatnot, right? That built, a strata of the world's most powerful billionaires that, quite frankly, supplanted to some degree, which were the world's billionaires before that in oil and gas. But then they found diffusion, and there was a way that fusion worked as opposed to the direction that the United States was going, to where there was a lot of incubator projects and renewables and all of the universities, and we were figuring out a multitude of paradigmatic formulations to try to sort out how you get off of the fossil fuel paradigm and create a renewable energy paradigm. And it's always cost, right? It's always risk reward. It's where the investors are. It's who's going to take, the lead from the universities and the government. And you can see a lot of that play out because of what took place over the course of the last, year during the first year of the second administration of the Trump MAGA zombie apocalypse and circus to hell. But what I don't think I ever really fully thought was possible until I saw it was that all of the universities were literally going to capitulate because what we did over the course of the last 40 years in the neoliberal era was we took out the R&D research of companies and we used the government to do R&D in universities where we provided billions of dollars of you know, research and development investment. And this would work, I don't know what the metaphor is, but it would work in congruency with the with the growth of technology and that sort of thing. And a lot of people like to mock Al Gore for his statement saying that he invented the internet. What he meant to say was he created legislation that allowed some of these things to evolve at universities that created the internet, right? And so, yeah, there was some true dynamic there. But again, when you need to understand the truth, you have to understand the nuances and really all of the different details. And people really just don't have that time for the most part. And I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to people that know that this is the end. Like for my generation, you remember Jim Morrison, wonderful, wonderful song about Vietnam. This is the end, my old friend, the end. I remember seeing that, and was it Apocalypse Now? I think it was Apocalypse Now. It might have been Platoon. I'm not sure. One of those two extraordinary Vietnam films, which plays into this, of course, because you know, uh, that was a huge piece of the global geopolitical chess pieces that would ultimately lead to everything that I'm revealing to you and I'm sitting on top of, and why we are due for another complete pivot reboot. Because what's going on with the Trump administration is really, it's so transparent, it's unbelievable. But at the same time, it's so transparently corrupt, it's unbelievable. All of the things that have been going on in the shadows for literally decades is now in the open. And a lot of the times, those of us who understood this stuff and scratched our heads would be like, wait a second, I wonder if because of all of these things are happening, how do they play out in the shadows, in the dark rooms, to be able to create the reality that we're all experiencing? And, a couple of elements that I'll, you know, use as examples, of course, that I think matriculate into everything that we're in the midst of is during the 80s, there was a very significant international gun dealer, gun arms, ammunition, all sorts of things, um, out of Saudi Arabia, a gentleman by the name of Adnan Khashoggi, who was used by the CIA primarily, and I believe Mossad and others in this whole case, to basically be involved in a shadow operation, I think directed by George Bush the first, CIA, to extrapolate dark money sources to provide black operations to provide weapons to Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war. Now, there was a lot more things going on than that. I mean, obviously, there's a million things going on every day all over the world and that sort of thing. And, what we're seeing in Venezuela is a piece of a long-standing sort of tradition. I know that many of you are laughing about Trump saying that this is the Donroe doctrine, even though he probably didn't know much about the Monroe Doctrine to begin with. But it was incredible to hear him say clearly and transparently that this is about the oil. I know some others that I watched out there like, yeah, it's not entirely about the oil. There's something else going on. Yeah, okay, but it's about the oil. It always is about the oil, and there's a reason it's all about the oil. Now, in this particular case, Don's like, look, because of the nationalization of American oil infrastructure that we put in there with our countries like Chevron and I think BP was involved and some other of the big heavies around the world. They nationalized it, and then of course that would ultimately lead to Maduro and what we're in the midst of, and of course this ridiculous scenario that it's all about uh, being an international drug terrorist or cartel or all these types of things, in lieu of what we just saw with pardoning, former Honduran President uh, Hernandez, in lieu of the fact that he had, been put away, I think, for the remaining years of his life in prison for being responsible for over 400 tons of cocaine being trafficked in the United States. But that bears, I think our attention from the standpoint of the vectors of South America into the United States market on two fronts, not just oil, but of course, drugs. Now, interestingly enough, those two correlate to kind of what I was talking to my friend Reagan about yesterday, which is imperialism. Imperialism has always been land grabs and control of resources, particularly gold, I think, throughout, quite frankly, the Middle Ages, maybe going back 1,000 years is one element of this. But, in the modern world, obviously, oil is a huge component of that. And as we're starting to see rare earth minerals for technology as well, of which I believe Venezuela has quite a good batch to be taken. And we've heard about Greenland, and I'm very well aware of our friends to the north in Canada, for example, particularly in the Alberta tar sands region. And what is so like yesterday, meaning it could have been 1996, and I was having this conversation that given what we know about climate science, given what we know about the warming planet and the oxidization of our reefs, what we know about the changing climate patterns that are destroying, not to mention our consumption of jungles and the ability to, create these, carbon sinks in places like the Amazon and so forth. When we rape and pillage the earth, there is a point of no return. In the oil industry, we used to talk about peak capacity. And by the way, just so you know, in my upbringing, in addition to being a rock and roller and a person who's always believed in liberty and justice for all, because I grew up after the civil rights era and I just never saw color in my life. And I'm just like, hey, man, it's every man for himself. And as long as you have a dynamic society where the rule of law is equal and bad guys can be held to account, then everybody can find their path and create, see a need, fill a need to try to move the population forward. That's just basically been my ideology, and it's really dynamism more above anything else. But dynamism predicated on democracy, predicated on the rule of law, the integrity of law, and character. I always love the idea of Top Gun pilots or astronauts and the guys with the right stuff. Because when you build these systems and when you become a Top Gun pilot, you can't fake your way to that. You can't be someone with the right stuff and fake your way to that. What made America great was the impetus for people in our society to have a vision of how they want to build their lives and to do everything they could to achieve that. And in doing so, they became remarkably good at what they did. And because we're such a huge society and we have so many different facets, I mean, we've done amazing things in innovation and sciences for healthcare and of course research and this, that, and the other. But equally, the profit motive has deformed that which we believed we are, which derives itself from dynamism. When you have a perverse economic system, what that means is that you're creating a ecosystem of deception. I frequently say the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. And that's what I mean by this. It's all deception. A house of cards, a three-card Monte, 26-dimensional chess, however you want to look at it, because people are crafty and really smart people with a lot of money and a lot of access to resources are extremely predictable. That's the thing. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so in the 90s, when we were pivoting towards a natural evolution to renewable energy because of the political will and the understanding in media and acceptance of what 97% of scientists had determined through the scientific method. And of course, when you think about peer review, it's extremely high standards. It's never 100%, but at the same time, a vast majority of experts in climate science discovered in the 70s that fossil fuel was creating an out of control scenario with emissions that were creating a warming of the planet that would change the entire climate, which would create calamity for all life on Earth because we just destroy the ecosystem of balance, which the Earth is. Now, interestingly enough, I just happened to go see the movie Avatar, Ash, Fire and Ash, I think it is, Fire and Ash, the third in the series, which spans roughly 20 years, right? And filmmaker James Cameron, our friend from Canada, who is a prolific Hollywood director who's done some of the greatest and thought-provoking and entertaining films, of my lifetime, starting with Terminator, which really definitely painted the picture of all things AI and what's to come in that particular venue. But also, of course, he did. I think everybody, at least our friends that are women, enjoyed Titanic. But that was an incredible masterpiece on disparity of wealth. And that was actually what took place. The people that were on the sinking ship because of stupidity, because of the rich class had a schedule to keep, took, chances that would ultimately have the largest and most, I guess, impenetrable or not. The idea was it was an unsinkable ship, the Titanic, right? And the irony was they took chances. They're running through, Iceland, no, Greenland, I guess it was closer to Greenland. Anyway, somewhere in the North Atlantic, and they strike an iceberg, and the next thing you know, it's all going down. And as we remember from that incredible film, it was the rich people that were able to get off. Now, I believe John Jacob Astor, one of the richest of all time, went down with the ship and some other things. But, the point being is that James Cameron had a kind of a big breadth of the way society functions, and he would deliver that in film with innovation and just incredible, adventurism in film. But then ultimately, he would deliver these products of these societal sort of question marks. And when we got into Avatar, the first one, I remember watching it and thinking to myself, wow, man, this guy is basically extracting everything that influenced him from Vietnam. The Mailing Massacre and all of these things that we were doing with dropping. I'm trying to think of I love the smell of napalm in the morning, right? And destroying all of these villages and that sort of thing. And that's the inhumanity and how it affected James Cameron. And I remember reading an interview with him at one point, and I believe he said, I think it was his brother was ended up being a Marine, and I think influenced him to create this character in Avatar, who's the nemesis or the antagonist to the protagonist, Solly. If you follow that film, I'm probably butchering his name, but anyway, but in the latest Avatar, which I thought was just extraordinary, was really it's just a continuation of this corporate exploitation of a planet to get as much out of it for the shareholders and those that run the scene, and they all play for the money, and they will take and take and take in every which way they can until they destroy the world, or the world fights back and destroys them. And that's the whole purpose of Avatar, right? And as we know with those characters, they're kind of like Native Americans or any kind of tribes people around the world that have to live in synchronicity with the earth and everything that it does from growing seasons and everything else. And so yeah, there's a conflict, right? That's pretty much been the conflict throughout the entirety of the growth of America, and also all of the contradictions that we all have to face over and over and over. But you know, we're at a pivotal moment. We're at the crossroads. We're at the devil's crossroads, and we are not going to get this country back unless tens of millions of you understand what's going on, specifically through the information I'm providing you, that then leads you to what's behind me, the Clean New Deal. Now, I want to say this up front, that if you know anyone running for office, please get this in front of them. We have a plan to be able to support people running for the Clean New Deal. I myself am not running for office because, even though I'm the furthest thing from it, I would never compare myself to the Reverend Martin Luther King. We're two completely different people. But I am leading a civil rights like movement to purge the tyranny of misery to unleash the renaissance of possibility. And the reason being is because I've got the answers. And it's not because I'm speaking out of turn, I'm speaking in tongues, I'm speaking from a position of ignorance. No, I had both the great misfortune and incredible opportunity to put my misfortune to use because of my skill set, because I am a producer, to be able to create this body of work over the course of the last 13 years. And it literally, and that's another reason why I'm very calm in delivering this message today, because it's just like I'm in the zone. I'm in the zone, and I know exactly where I came from, and I know exactly what I have, and I know exactly I have to penetrate to convince you to believe me, because there are no other choices. And what I mean by that is that, for the last, I don't know, call it most of my life, I've been a Democrat. I've always been a progressive. I always believe in, civil rights. I always believe in fair options, and I believe in, everybody being held to account. And I know that people are flawed, and I know that the law is flawed, and I know all of these other things because I've been around this earth for 57 freaking years. And the bottom line is I've seen a few things in my day, but at the same time, I believe in dynamism. And again, you know, look, we're never going to get it completely right, but what we're in the midst of is literally game over. Unless you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in liberty and dignity and decency and integrity and equality and sustainability and beauty, if we merge behind the Clean New Deal, it'll be our destiny, to purge the misery of tyranny and unleash the renaissance of possibility. And so, from the standpoint of, I want you to think about this in terms of all of the big things that are happening that are shaping the world we live in. So, first and foremost, Venezuela, again, we had an infrastructure with our oil companies that then, were nationalized, seized, however you want to think about it, in a so-called socialist government, which was, probably just another form of trying to think of the appropriate term, I guess, like what we're in the midst of, right? I'm searching for the words. Anytime you have a criminal sort of enterprise, or excuse me, a criminal corrupt leadership operation and organization, I mean, autocrats are one thing that comes to mind. Fascists are another that come to mind. I always say that we're not a democracy; we're a corporate fascist system undergirded by a criminal syndicate. And there's more to that statement, and I'll come back to it. But the companies always had a play, apparently, to get Venezuela back because, in the grand scheme of things, our refineries down in Texas are set up to be able to refine heavy crude. And so they're just enormous deposits that can change the outlook of the sort of oil matrix on a global economic scale that then in turn provide leverage to the United States and whatever these guys are behind the scenes that have been in control for a very long time. And like I said, pretty much since the end of World War II. But going into the kind of the details of the nature of what we've come out of and when things turned the wrong way was after 9/11. So during 9/11, before that, we had terrorist attacks all over the world. We had Al Qaeda attacking embassies in Nairobi and the USS Cole and many other things. It was like a shadow war, but it was significant, and we never knew where they were going to hit next. And then, we seemed to be on our heels the whole time, trying to play catch up. And there was this sort of, I kind of accepted the Tom Clancy approach that in this, big geopolitical mess, that there were good guys in the CIA trying to sort out who our enemies were and, take them down before they could do anything, too, I don't know, devastating to us. But at the time, I had written a script, by the way, called Mayhem that basically predicted what happened on 9/11. And there's another story to that. But when 9/11 happened, I remember going, oh my God, oh my God, it came. Everything that I was envisioning that I thought might happen came. And I remember that fateful morning watching, these charred souls leaping from, the 103rd and 7th floor of the World Trade Centers. And I had been in the World Trade Centers many times. I'd been to the top of the world restaurant. And, it had a lot of meaning for me. I mean, it was something that we saw in all of our television shows. It kind of exemplified American power. And of course, that's why Osama bin Laden, Al Qaeda attacked it, because it was attacked before in 1993, of course, right? By Osama bin Laden's, I believe, uncle or something to that effect. Maybe I'm confusing terrorists, but the long and the short of it was that the nature of, and I remember it was the early time of social media, and there were friends of mine that were actually in the vicinity of the buildings and watching those same people fall out. And during that time period, I got a phone call, and I mentioned this recently in one of my truth bombs, but I had written a screenplay, like I said, describing what I thought was going to happen in a fictional way. Again, I'm a producer, screenwriter, filmmaker, that kind of thing, and I'd gotten a great script called Mayhem to one of the prolific, production companies in the country, and they were kind of poo-pooing it. And one of the director of acquisitions called me the morning of 9/11. In fact, that was the first call I got on 9/11, and he said, "Have you looked at your TV yet?" And I turned on the television and saw the building on fire, and I was like, "Oh my God!" And he was like, "Do you think this has anything to do with what you wrote?" And we were both on the phone at the same time when the second plane hit the second tower, and I was like, "Yeah, this is mayhem." And it was mayhem. So it was kind of a prolific title for that. But it was a missed opportunity for me because at the time, we were fully ensconced prior to all of this development in Lewinsky Gate. And at that time, Kenneth Starr, pardon me, was, of course, the lead, prosecutor from the Republican side trying to impeach President Clinton at that time, who had already deregulated all of the financial entities that would lead to the financial terrorism that was actually happening at the same time. So what happened was after 9/11, we had moved all of the resources from white collar fraud in the FBI and the Department of Justice into anti-terrorism campaigns. And so they started getting into the whole, money laundering scenario, this, that, and the other. And they took away resources to, rein in financial fraud. Now, for those of you who understand my work, you understand that a lot of times I go back to the 80s and I start referencing the savings and loan crisis and, of course, the junk bond scenario, and ultimately all of those things that led to pump and dump schemes that became the tech bubble, and then ultimately Enron and WorldCom and many other bubbles at that time period. And most of that was because we had this internal sort of rift where we took all of the professionals that reined in financial fraud and they went into anti-terrorism efforts, right? So that was the first situation. Now, simultaneously, and I got to tell you, having grown up as a rock and roller and somebody who's been in the mix of more mosh pits than you can imagine, and stage diving and all sorts of crazy activity in my life, not to mention many, many fist fights, I know that you can't fight on your heels. If somebody gets a sucker punch in on you or they turn off the lights and you don't see it coming, you're at a disadvantage. And ultimately, that's the analogy of what I believe we've been in the midst of since, quite frankly, we had the opportunity to move the entire country into a renewable energy paradigm to wean ourselves from fossil fuel, all of the wars that have been going on prior to that. But then all of a sudden, here we get hit with 9/11. It all made sense in terms of the chronology. It all made sense in terms of we saw the coal, we saw all of these different things Al Qaeda was involved with. But what we ultimately ended up discovering, and this is after the 9/11 Commission report, and we found out the 9/11 Commission report was tainted. And a lot of people in mainstream media refer to the 9/11 Commission report as kind of the gold standard, but it wasn't even remotely the gold standard. I want to say it cost $14 million to do the investigation into something that would lead to a multi-trillion-dollar war, 25 years in the making, and millions of dead around the world that created this world that we live in, and for the reasons that we're looking right down the barrel of the gun again in terms of Venezuela, and moving on to the next step, if it goes into tar sands in Canada and Alberta, if it goes into Greenland and that sort of situation, what we're doing is we're doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on the oil financial paradigm that I uncovered in my work Forward 13, because I knew the right questions to ask. I grew up in Houston, Texas. My dad was in, kind of a bigwig general counsel for a huge natural gas company and liquefied natural gas at that, out of Houston, Texas, and international, tanking and shipping and all of these things. And I thought it was amazing because he was in the midst of all of that kind of stuff in terms of, Tom Clancy interactions with governments. And then ultimately, my grandfather was a wildcatter. He funded all sorts of oil deals. And I was an Oiler my whole life. In fact, a Houston Oiler at that, right? Go Houston Texans against the Pittsburgh Steelers for those paying attention. But I understand the oil industry, and I've understood it since I was in elementary school, quite frankly. I've certainly known a lot more about it since then, but geopolitics and everything else. And by the way, when I grew up in Houston, Texas, I used to see Saudis driving around in uh, convertible Cadillacs with the horns on the front, and I'm like, oh my god. But meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, and all of this stuff is happening out of Houston, Texas, that, Khashoggi is involved with arms dealings. And as it turns out, they're using a lot of the S&Ls. And this is the case of George Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, who, of course, was completely mocked by Trump in the 2016 election. And, of course, the brother of George Bush, I should say, George W. Bush. And, he was involved with the S&Ls. And there was a lot of money laundering and all of these different scenarios with all of these underground shady characters and drug dealers and this, that, and the other, and CIA and Contragate and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of this stuff goes into, quite frankly, what was happening in Atlantic City with Donald Trump and all things Donald Trump real estate. I've got a colleague, a friend, a guy that I think has done some prolific work. His name is Zev Shalev. I highly encourage you to check out Zev Shalev on Substack and go to his narrative, and there you'll find the greatest heist and read it over and over and over. It's a deep dive into all of these elements that put all of these characters together that were in these, two huge sort of vectors: Houston, Texas, primarily, and New York City. In New York City, I wouldn't say primarily. The financial side of it is is important as the oil side, but all of it is. And the craziest thing about some of these revelations from Zev's work is that he puts pretty much the ecosystem starting in Olympic Towers, and I believe I think it was the east side of Manhattan. It might have been south side, but anyway, the people that were involved in living in this building were Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi, arms dealer, um, Robert Maxwell, who many might recognize the name as the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, and Donald Trump. And as it turns out, according to Zeb's work, is that Donald Trump, because who he is, as he came from Fred Trump, and he was trying to make a big splash in Manhattan as a huge developer, got involved with the five families, all of those sorts of scenarios, was already involved with all sorts of shady stuff, and he becomes this sort of target of the Russians, who were extracting a lot of money because that was a time period when the Soviet Union was involved with collapsing, and they were flooding Western market with rubles to basically get involved with all sorts of this contextual financial fraud that was stemming from the S&L crisis, which was mostly commercial real estate fraud. And there was a lot of elements, by the way, and I've learned this from my mentor, a gentleman by the name of William K. Black, with his team when he was at the Office of Thrift Supervision and the General Counsel at the trying to think of the bank out of San Francisco, but he was also would eventually work with Ed Gray, and they had $100 million budget to go in this sort of massive national criminal enterprise that were using S&Ls based on all of this interest rate swaps and things that didn't happen before deregulation that took place at that time period, that would become these vectors of all of this money laundering. And, it was really run through the CEOs, and ultimately Bill Black would get over 7,000 convictions because of this whole panoply of how it works within our justice system to be able to bring cases and do the investigations and get the information to be able to get the indictments, to get the convictions. But he was flipping the lower level guys, the lower level guys, the lower level guys, and getting coverage throughout the United States through all of the media that was paying attention, and then ultimately would take down the CEOs, just like they were dons in a criminal enterprise. And right about that time, earlier than that, I should say, 20 years earlier than that, of course, many of you might remember that then, district attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan, I believe at that time was, Rudolph Giuliani, who was in the midst of racketeering cases, and he literally brought, RICO to the fore, to where they used these, mammoth cases to put all of the pieces together to take down organized crime. So these two different forces are playing out in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And at that time, and it's always been this way in the United States. I mean, there's always outlaws, there's always bank robbers, there's always people up to no good, but that's why you have the law. You give people freedom, and not everybody is a crook, right? But unfortunately, it becomes problematic when the crook becomes the president. So remember back during the 70s, of course, Nixon saying, I'm not a crook. And of course, he was a crook. And as it turns out, Watergate was a lot more involved with what I'm saying contextually than it was just stealing, records from the Democratic Party. It was involved with a lot of this geopolitical type stuff. Of course, it was, right? But the law actually worked on behalf of the American people. And there were also people like Bill Black. And in fact, my friend and colleague, Reagan Boychuk, did, I think, appropriately point out that, really Bill Black and his team were the only time in history that a government could work on behalf of the people, for example, no matter what country it's in, and take down the elites, otherwise known as the aristocracy. Now, let's think about that for a second, because, if you're like me, you might say to yourself, well, wait a second, wasn't that the whole purpose of the American Revolution? Yeah, it was. And we're approaching the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. A revolution that was against tyranny, even though, of course, those of us who have seen Ken Burns' American Revolution, there's a lot of complicated things that were happening at that time that I don't want to litigate right now. But yeah, it's not the perfect story. And yeah, I did grow up in the 70s with Schoolhouse Rock and Peanuts and Good Feelings and Vibes, and, do unto others as they do unto you, and in the aftermath of the civil rights. And I mean, I just think I was so fortunate that I was born at a time, literally only 23 years after the end of World War II, right? And the Holocaust was probably the biggest influence in my entire life. Never again to allow, massive carnage of destroying human beings based on just an outward projection of we are more than you. Again, I call out to my hero Joe Strummer in a wonderful song called White Riot, or I'm probably confusing or conflating a couple of those lyrics and songs, but the granularity of, understanding in the aftermath of World War II, a world that was built to create this sort of fair play of democracies, in the United States, who was victorious and becomes the ultimate superpower, before we were, obviously in a two-man race, if you will, two-country race with the Soviet Union, until they spent themselves into oblivion because of all the nature of economics. And then ultimately they're, stalwarts from the Politburo, according to Zev Shalev, were taking out all their money and extracting it because they couldn't beat the United States militarily. And his thesis is that they were going to use our greed and our short term, because they understood what was going on during this time period of savings and loan crisis. And quite frankly, if I really think about it, based on what some of the stuff my colleague Reagan has said, it does appear that if you're a communist, for example, and let's say you're learned and you know the history books of Western imperialism and aristocracies and everything else, you understand how those systems operate. And if you're a catalyst against those and you want to destroy them, you could theoretically use their greed, their monopolization, their tyranny against them to destroy them. And that's what Zev Shalev points out with this amazing amount of money that starts flowing through American markets that ultimately get germinated into using Donald Trump as a useful idiot at that time. And this time period being the Olympic Towers, and this intersection between Robert Maxwell and Adnan Khashoggi and so forth. And, you know, Trump being, as, sort of ambitious as he is to be the guy that could control, media and this and that and all of those, relationships he had with the mob. And as you know, if you've watched our Truth Bombs, I have an interaction with a gentleman by the name of David K. Johnston, who lays out extraordinary information that Donald Trump has been involved with laundering money for drug dealers into real estate, into his real estate, since the 80s. And this was known in the 90s and so on and so forth. And it really did set the table. It's extraordinary when you think about this, particularly from a fictional depiction like a Tom Clancy novel or a Robert Ludlum novel, where in this particular case, by the time we get to the early 2000s, remember, Donald Trump becomes the face of The Apprentice. He's this celebrity, he's this goofball, he sits in this Trump Tower and he has these competitions week in and week out. And meanwhile, it's kind of an advertising sketch. And I think it went 19 seasons. Did it go that long? It couldn't have gone 19 seasons. It must have been like 14 seasons. But in either case, the it really should be questionable when you think about the executive producer, Mark Burnett, who's actually out of London. Mark Burnett does the deal with NBC. They legitimize Trump. Trump, prior to that, was in and out of all sorts of economic turmoil. I think he'd been through, at that time, 5 or 6 bankruptcies. And every single time he seems to find a way out, a crazy way out. One of the ways out that he was bailed out by none other than the Rothschild hedge fund group, which was at that time chaired by Wilbur Ross. And Wilbur Ross becomes known as this sort of, I don't know, he buys failing companies on the cheap and then he owns them and does these magnet type stuff all over the world. And Wilbur Ross, and I've been right next to his office, which is pretty goddamn extraordinary because I was filming an interview in the con that enabled me to be there, which is extraordinary. But Wilbur Ross ends up becoming, I think, the Secretary of Chamber of Commerce during Bush the First. And yeah, there was a lot of play between Rothschild Group and Wilbur Ross. And, of course, a lot of people associate Rothschild with, being one of the early sort of financial partners of Israel, so to speak. I don't know all the ins and outs of the Rothschild Group there. I know a lot of people are like, Baron Rothschild and the whole, banking family dynasty that goes back centuries because of their interplay with things that were happening in Europe, particularly in England, and they got very involved with the Central Bank of England, as well as things that were happening in France and Germany. And a lot of people accused them for fomenting the wars. They were just financing the wars. And, in terms of actual, duplicity by way of their marksmanship within their financialization sort of innovation, the only thing that I'm aware of that they did at a mass level that nobody else did and did it better than everybody else was front running. I think from the late 1700s forward, but by the time they're deeply involved with New York and Wall Street, yeah, they're low man on the totem pole. I mean, the big guns are J.P. Morgan Chase back in the day, and then all of the big guys from Goldman Sachs and, of course, Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley and all of these other huge in investment banks, got deeply immersed into a lot of the things that I have been revealing for like the last now 13 years, right? And so the picture that I'm painting for you is that the nature and the magnitude of now is everything that's been going on in the shadows for the last 30 to 50 years. Now it's just in the open. Now it's got complete control. And this is what I've been warning against in my truth bombs, in my collective work, to try to galvanize millions of people in a political sort of awakening to understand the nature of the paradigm of corporations first and foremost, but what the financial structure is and the legal structure. Because I always said that corruption births and fuels fascism. And so to pick up on where I left off in terms of our description of, America is not a democracy. America does not function as a capitalistic system. We're a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses the full faith and credit of the United States to guarantee the mafiocracy that is now fueling fascism. So let's fill in a couple of blanks real quick that is front and center and everybody now knows it. So it's crazy, right? The New York Times in 2025 finally did a story connecting the financial apparatus of JP Morgan Chase to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, they only did kind of a first level of it, which included this gentleman by the name of Jess Staley, who was super tight with Jeffrey Epstein. And, He was second in line to become the CEO of Chase, which was interesting because he came out of Brazil and there was a lot of carnage of corruption in Brazil throughout the 80s and the 90s. And kudos to you, Brazil, if you happen to be watching, because you got it right with your Supreme Court over the course of the last, several years. And of course, your former president's on the run and now back in prison. This before we, are into all of the other stuff. But the nature and the magnitude of the scope of the shadow sector and finance has always been amongst us. I'm absolutely convinced of that. I think about imperialism. I think about, fascism. I think about all of these corollaries. You could go through every single aspect of history and you can always look at the finance and the money and who's doing what, when, and where. And it's all undergirded every single part of this. Okay. But we don't need to litigate 1,000 years of history. What we really need to focus on is that time period that encapsulates what was happening in Olympic Tower with Donald Trump, with Robert Maxwell, with, of course, Adnan Khashoggi as an undercurrent to what now is. Okay. So, in addition to JP Morgan Chase, which, of course, is the nation's largest bank, they're involved with, I believe, managing somewhere in the $1.5 billion range for many, many years with Jeffrey Epstein and the way that that all rolls out. And I did an incredible interview in one of my truth bombs recently with the gentleman who was the senior investigations editor for the New York Times, a guy by the name of David Enrich, who I know, and I've interviewed him several times. He and his team put together the forensics on how this whole operation at JP Morgan Chase worked in what it did and to what end. Now, that was to basically deride questions, if you want to know the truth. Questions, I believe, for Congress. But again, I want to remind you, we're in 2025, and we see all over social media release the Epstein files, release the Epstein files, release the Epstein files. Then we saw on this whole carnage of everything before Venezuela, there was like, okay, we're not going to release what we're supposed to release based on the Epstein Transparency Act, with Wakakis and Rokana and so on and so forth, and Thomas Massey. But then it was reported, oh, we've got a million more documents that we're going to release, and all of those other things. And I feel like I want to mention at this moment too, which is really interesting in terms of the Epstein files, that I mentioned the name Kenneth Starr. Kenneth Starr was the lead prosecutor that tried to take down former President Clinton on Lewinsky Gate through impeachment. And then this guy becomes an attorney that is defending Epstein. Now, how's that just in terms of being able to demonstrate the slippery slope and the madness of the legal profession, especially where there's a lot of money and power involved? And what is happening with the Epstein files now is everybody is asking the right question. Why is there a group, a tiny group of people that are above the law that have all the power? Again, that's the notion of aristocracy, is it not? Again, we're about to have the 250th anniversary of the United States that was born because they broke the grip of King Henry VIII and the paradigm of the East India Trading Company, i.e., the Parliament slash Royal Navy, and of course the Redcoats, which were the obviously the muscle at that time in what was the most powerful military financial apparatus kingdom in the history of the world that our founding fathers were able to defeat, which were the only people to do it, to create the Bill of Rights, to create the Constitution, to create the notion of and for by the people, and with liberty and justice for all, which we all pledged allegiance to, except half of us really misunderstood the whole thing, which was, let's go land grab and destroy everybody for the white people and we'll exploit everybody else. Okay, there's that. Which is an equally impactful aspect of our society and why we're in the hellhole that we're in the midst of right now, because it is literally always a struggle between the forces of good and evil, quite frankly, it has been throughout history. And it is pretty much that. I do believe it's that because, when you understand, and I know millions of you do, that Epstein was about preying on vulnerable young girls to be able to exploit them in a grotesque sexual perversity and to get everybody in on it. So everybody had something on somebody else, which is the way it's done, by the way, in blackmail. And they have this sort of inside, like, my favorite comedian of all time, George Carlin, said, it's a big club and you're not in it. Well, this is a club I prefer not to be in, just like P. Diddy's, freak off. Those were, even though I will say that I had a chance to go to a P. Diddy party during the Sundance Film Festival, I think in 2006-ish. And I had a big thing going on that I didn't want to leave. So I'm kind of glad that I missed the opportunity. But yes, I had an actual cab out front waiting to take me and a bunch of people to it. And I do know people who went, and they never said they got roofied, raped, and pillaged. But I kind of wonder at this stage of the game if they did. I haven't talked to them in a long time. But all of these forces are happening over the course of the last 4 decades, and none of them are resolved. Okay. So, first and foremost, again, Khashoggi, Saudi Arabia, Maxwell, supposedly, Mossad, but as it turns out, he was deeply involved with KGB, and he was deeply involved with CIA. And according to Zev Shalev, I think he tried to steal or at least put on ice $500 million, from the CIA. And I think he stole from everybody. I think he looted everybody. And you'd have to be absolutely out of your mind or have balls the size of a fucking elephant to be able to, betray the CIA, KGB, and Mossad. But he ends up getting, this incredible funeral in the is it the Garden of Olives? It's like a cemetery for all of the heroes of Israel. But they, they found him belly up, or I guess face down, even though it was supposedly a great swimmer off of his yacht in the Mediterranean. So there's that. But of course, he's Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and Ghislaine Maxwell connects with Epstein, and Epstein ends up being this guy that comes from nowhere, although he's in Dalton, which is this elite school. And, the father just happens to be Barr, who happens to be the father of William Barr, who happens to be the assistant attorney general during Bush time, during Contragate, that ultimately ends up during the Trump administration. And of course, that's when Epstein, suicided himself, as we like to say, right? So there's already millions of you out there who already have your own judgment. You already know this is really whacked and everything else. But I'm telling you, it's the tip of the iceberg to what the con is and where I went after I got my life turned upside down, where I ended up going on the road to make Prologue Forward 13, which, by the way, puts together the confluence of the financial, excuse me, the fossil fuel, financial, military, industrial paradigm. It puts that hierarchy at the center of all things power of the United States. And that was the purpose of Forward 13, waking up the American dream. As I was digging out of the 2008 great financial crisis, searching for the answers that I have. And ultimately, in that film, and I'll put this in the description below, one of the most incredibly important moments of that film, I went to go speak with like the senior professor at Rice University in Houston, Texas, who is all things expert in the financial fuel apparatus. And this guy came out of Shell. I think he was general counsel at Shell before he was at Rice University. But one of the most probably prolific experts in all things the geopolitics of all things oil. And the way he lays it out in Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, is that these investments of these giant fossil fuel companies engenders all of these investment banks, and they have to go find oil where the oil is, because I mentioned earlier peak oil. This was before the fracking revolution, and now we're the largest producer of oil on the planet. But of course, that's not enough because of the nature of the geopolitics and the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency, predicated on the financial fossil fuel paradigm. And all of that's in my work, by the way. But what he lays out is that the investment protocol is simply that, look, if you're going to go find a place in Eastern Africa, for example, in your hedge fund, and you're pulling in all of these billions of dollars of investment capital that are going to go through these huge oil companies, let's just call it Chevron or BP or whomever else that was like in Venezuela, you invest for decades, because that's how long it takes to get the infrastructure. You have to have the control, then you have to be able to build and drill the fields, and then you be able to, exploit the find, and then you have to export. I mean, there's a whole paradigm. It's incredibly complicated, incredibly diverse, and incredibly brilliant and ingenious, by the way, which built really the society that we're in the midst of, right? And so there's the iron grip of the investors that are like, it takes decades to get your money back, and once the money starts to flow, it really flows, and then you end up doing it over and over and over. And that's what we've got in Venezuela. It's payback for the oil companies and the investors. They're going to get their money back because they got a transactional con artist, Donald Trump, who beyond real estate lives for oil. Who are all of his backers? All of the Middle Eastern states: Saudi, UAE, um, uh, I'm thinking of Qatar, right? Was it Qatar that provided the 747, or was it UAE? I'm getting them conflated because I think we provided 2 billion. They paid 2 billion, and we're giving them AI technology. Yeah, they're the ones that are plowing billions of dollars into the Liberty Financial and backdooring through crypto, all of this insane criminality. But the nature of all of these things and what I'm piecing together for you is what my gut told me. I think back in, I want to say I was making Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, when I started postulating these questions. And I started thinking to myself, okay, what the hell is going on here? And at that time period, it really looked like there was this guy, I'm trying to think of his name. He was in charge of all of the Republican, kind of the tax policy, and they had said famously, we have to squeeze government to where it could be fit into a bathtub, and that sort of thing. And that was on. So they wanted to destroy the administrative state. Who's they? The libertarian billionaires that back these guys to do these think tanks to kind of control the system that led to, of all things, Project 2025. And Project 2025 is a fusion of really everything I'm talking about. So the Heritage Foundation initially came out of, from what I understand, I just learned this recently, Adolf Coors, and Adolf Coors is a known neo-Nazi, and of course, yes, that's the Coors beer company that, obviously they were worth mega billions back in the 70s when they started the Heritage Foundation, but it merged with the Koch enterprises, and the Koch brothers, of course, we all know, primarily they're in a lot of things like timber and all sorts of different derivatives of, quite frankly, fossil fuel and timber and all sorts of building and this, that, and the other. But the Kochs became, one of the most wildly successful slash richest people on the planet. But it all emanated from their father, Fred Koch, not to be confused with Fred Trump, who basically came out of the oil industry. He built Stalin's infrastructure, which were one of the largest, if not the largest producer of oil for many, many, many decades. So he was a free marketeer and selling to the communists, who weren't really communists. They were the Politburo, you know, super conflated aristocracy or criminal, enterprise of the Politburo. It's central. Doesn't matter what the centrality is. It's all the same thing. It's just the hierarchy of power. Okay. And, it doesn't care what the ideology is. It's just we're in control and fuck everybody else. So Fred Koch comes back, has all of this ideology, this free market ideology, plugs his billions of dollars into all sorts of think tanks, everything else. The Koch brothers, made this thing a science a long, long time ago, really hitting its stride in the 80s. I mean, they created George Mason University, they infiltrated law firms all around the country, and they created Americans for Prosperity, which picked up right after the 2008 great financial crisis to make this big push to what now has become MAGA. And they are all about basically, and this is what's so ridiculous about libertarians. They're like, yeah, no government, it's just about, making it safe so that big libertarian billionaires can basically rule the world is what it's all about. So they're Confederates, you know what I mean? That's clearly what they are. And but yet they're extremely savvy, they're extremely connected. And this guy, Russell Vogt, who we provide, or excuse me, who we credit for Project 2025, has he came out of the school of Phil Gramm. Phil Gramm was a senator from the state of Texas, deeply involved with the banking industry. His wife, Wendy Lee Graham, was on the board of Enron. So there were the fusion of banking and financial, fossil fuel, and they created all the deregulation of the late 90s with the Clinton administration that has created this mayhem, which has legalized corruption and deception for the elite class. But here's the key consideration: they destroyed the world. It's not sustainable. After 9/11, and again, I don't know if I said this, I've lectured a lot about this, but, you know, as it turns out, the biggest red flag of all in terms of mainstream media, and of course, we all know that Donald Trump has been saying for decades, fake media this, fake media that, because he's been playing media for himself like a fiddle the whole time. And yeah, journalists can be bought and paid, and they can be manipulated and told to tell certain stories, and there's not a standard like we had during Walter Cronkite. And even then, there was some problems because Walter Cronkite, as I learned recently from David Sirota, had attended, the sort of, I don't know, corporate functions of all things tobacco companies that gave us none other than, the Supreme Court Justice Powell, who came out of the tobacco industry, that ultimately created this initiative to create this corporate hierarchy and takeover of the United States back in the 70s. And that's what this has all been about, right? And so there was the civil rights movement, there was the anti-war movement during Vietnam, there was this sort of awakening of the American people that gave us, a lot of people in government that actually were thinking on behalf of, government, of, by, and for the people, that would lead to people like William K. Black and many others. But at the same time, it also led to people like Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton was this ultimate sort of, charlatan, who was this guy who could, sell the aw shucks, I'm one of you kind of people, while at the same time doing business with the most dangerous people on earth and giving them, a leg up to be able to control the system, which is what he did. He basically, my colleague Eric Vaughn always says, it took Kissinger to go to China. It took Clinton to basically destroy the Democratic Party. And why is this important? Because as we're into the new year and as we're moving forward to the midterm elections, we're already seeing, and we have been seeing since the re-election, which I think is a stolen election of Donald Trump. I happen to watch a very compelling podcast earlier today where a gentleman who I've never seen, he just happened to pop up, but I could tell very quickly that he was a very seasoned veteran of journalism, and he knew the right questions to ask and how to frame things. But the subject was how Trump and Elon stole the election. And he gave a lot of really very compelling evidence to wit, would just maybe suggest that, yeah, there's still an open-ended question on the 2024 election, as it was, I guess, yeah, it was 2024 because, of course, 2025 is when Trump took office and everything that's happened since. But that's the biggest consideration that you guys have to think about. There's question marks of the 2024 election. There's question marks of 9/11. There's question marks of 2008 because 99% of you don't know the information that I have. And then, of course, however you want to, figure out and contextualize COVID and this whole thing. I always say that as it relates to COVID, the only thing I can really tell you is that there was insane fraud happening that seemed to be coming and hinting towards all the criminals in the world, quite frankly, from Donald Trump. It was a big payout to a lot of criminals. Yeah, a lot of American families got $1,600 checks for a family of four. I think there was two of those. Yeah, but the one percenters got at least $1 million in subsidies, and that's not to mention the tens of trillions of dollars that went into basically plugging holes and creating this mammoth debt that we have on the other side of both 2009 and COVID and whatever comes next, right? And by the way, let's not forget that war is good for debt, which seems to be on the horizon here. So as we plow forward, what I'm telling you is the Democrats do not have a plan, requisite the corruption. They're not here to fix the problem. They're here to play anti-Trump. Trump is a villain. If you take out Trump, then everything will be solved. No, Donald Trump is not the mastermind of this stuff. He never created any of it. He's a bumbling idiot. We could see the whole time. He's an opportunist that we used for what he had because he was born with a lot of money on third base. And from the very beginning, he was a useful idiot. It was his proximity, it was his celebrity. Everybody who were the dark side of this stuff, I mean, they just basically wag the dog. And he does it every single day, and he's unapologetic about it. And, the greatest thing about Donald Trump is that he proves everything that I've been telling you for now years through all of my collective work, but he's doing it more effectively because what he's doing is he's literally smashing the silos. Nobody's safe. They can't stay in their little make believe worlds and act as if, well, we're not going to have to get involved with the situation because we're untouchable, aka Harvard University, Princeton, this, that, and the other, or tall building law firms, or fill in your media. And now, and again, I remind you, I've said forever, corruption burrs and fuels fascism. And ultimately, now what we're looking at is media that has been completely, and we've seen this now for decades, honestly. We've seen private equity and hedge funds buy all of independent media or newspapers to be able to thwart investigative journalism. And then ultimately, we're seeing these mega mergers of these huge titans of particularly technology. In the case of Larry Ellison and his son David Ellison, who have purchased Paramount and are bidding for HBO, Time Warner, and buying CNN. And obviously they took over 60 Minutes and all things. God, that crazy 30-something lesbian whose name eludes me at the moment, who obviously is destroying 60 Minutes, even though 60 Minutes has been playing for the corporate machine for a long time. So, seriously, everything is transparent. It's the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid. So, what are you going to do? Well, you have to have a plan that is requisite the corruption, which is the Clean New Deal. And I'm going to run through that just briefly, even though I've been talking a long time, but only the future of the world is on the line here, guys. And I have to somehow convince many millions of you to believe me, to discover me, to share me, to realize who I am and what I've done. And it's not about me. I'm not trying to be a dictator. I'm not trying to be your savior. The truth is our collective savior. I'm just the liberator trying to break the shackles of this corruption in the shadows. Like I've said, I think 3 times now, to destroy the misery of tyranny and unleash the renaissance of possibility. Is dire as all of this stuff is, you've got to believe me. This is the greatest opportunity in our entire lives. This is such an enormous opportunity to shape shift the world. It's going to happen one way or the other. The question is, what is going to be the consequence of now before it all happens? Is it going to happen as a result of all this insanity now that's been the result of the last 50 years? Or are we going to have to wait a millennium after, I don't know, 3/4 of the population dies? Because that's quite frankly, I think, the question at hand because of everything that's going on. So this is what I propose, okay? And if you look through this, you can see who we are. You can get the answers of how this affects you personally, because that's always the question people ask, right? Well, how does this affect me? And they put their heads in the sand. And meanwhile, the less they do, it just led to this whole situation. When you're not engaged, this is what happens. And we had the power of the vote, we had the power to hold power to account, but we didn't. We collectively, the people, have failed the American Revolution. We failed all of the things that led, from the abolitionists through the Civil War into, of course, we went to Jim Crow down south, but we had civil rights after the fact. And then in the interim, we had the war on fascism. But of course, then we had the Cold War. So, what I say here, guys, is that we don't live in a democracy. We don't function as a capitalistic system. We don't have free markets. The law is unequal. We don't have separation of powers. Corruption rules everything. And millions are beginning to understand the threat of Project 2025. The Clean New Deal is democracy's answer. So, again, for those of you who worship Bernie Sanders is a good human being. He doesn't fully understand the contextualization of how you fund the federal government, although he does, but he still looks at it from the framing of being the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. And that's a different fundamental budgeting scenario for communities and states and cities, and of course, everything not the federal government, first and foremost. But Bernie has known all of the information that I've had the whole time. But Bernie has chosen to make a Faustian bargain. He's played ball on the corrupt's rules because he chose not to use the information we have that he had proximity to. In fact, I'll tell you right now, the biggest red flag for me was in 2016 when the DNC was kneecapping him and he was in a debate with Hillary Rodham Clinton in Brooklyn. He said Wall Street's business model is fraud. And you could have heard a pin drop. And nobody followed up. Nobody asked him to decide, say exactly what he was talking about. He never had the chance. And then, they did ask Hillary Rodham Clinton why she took payments to do speeches for Goldman Sachs. And she said, yeah, that's what they offered. I can't believe how gullible Americans are, but they bought it. We bought it. The DNC bought it. They, shepherded Hillary Rodham Clinton. But at the same time, because of all of the fraud and the corruption that Obama had covered up, which I reveal, ultimately, the opportunistics, criminal syndicate that represents some really tough, hombres from around the world, including, of course, Vladimir Putin. They used their useful idiot and they penetrated our elections. They helped Donald Trump get elected in 2016. Yes, that is all real, but they weren't the only ones. There was the Mercers, the billionaire class, the Adelson, and so on and so forth. It was a billionaire criminal apparatus global that is involved with finance, oil, and the military industrial complex. Okay. That's just really what it is now in the light that they won because they're more committed, they're more ambitious. Right after 9/11, I used to say things like, if we love and value liberty and justice more than the terrorists love jihad, we'll be victorious. What I didn't really count on was the corruption. What I really underestimated was the illegality of the fraudsters that could use all sorts of tactics to buy complicity within the system itself, particularly with high paying attorneys, AKA Kenneth Starr, for example, right? And so ultimately, I lay out how this affects you, what we must do, the precepts of the Clean New Deal, and more importantly, the white papers. And I'm just going to briefly open this up. This is the most important thing you will ever find in your journey to truth, because once you understand this information, there's no going back. So, in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, which we show you in the con, and I will show you, in addition to the link of Forward 13, I will put together a link of the con season 1 and season 2. I was able to get the con season 1 out there for a long time. We allowed it to be out there for free for a long time. It took us millions of dollars to get this information and put it together, but we could never really build the audience. And I'm absolutely convinced now we were thwarted, not just by the algorithms and the way things work, but also the hierarchy of power that's created this systemology of basically propaganda. It's everything that we're seeing in all major media. And for those of you scratching your head going, yeah, that's just, conspiracy theory. Well, conspiracy is actually a thing if you can prove it. And that's a whole nother can of worms, because the Supreme Court said after they etch a sketched the, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, where they basically erased U.S. history so that, somebody who was involved with an insurrection can run for the highest office. The magnitude of conspiracy, my friends, is so beyond anything of your wildest dreams. And it's all evidentiary. So that's where we get into racketeering, RICO. You remember I mentioned all things Rudolph Giuliani? That's what he used to turn the tables on the 5 families of the mob. For anybody who watches The Sopranos and all of the rest of it, RICO, racketeering, is how you flip lower rings to get the information and the aspects and the fingerprints and the emails and this, that, and the other, which is what we did with the con, which is what the full scope of the United States didn't do. And President Obama hid, as did a former attorney general, Eric Holder, because here's the big thing. The 2008 great financial crisis, just like the Epstein debacle, preying on young girls who didn't have the resources to coerce them into a situation, whether it was like, hey, you want to go to law school, you want a better life, you want some money, you want this, that, and the other. No problem. You just come into our fold and do what we tell you, and it'll be a transactional situation. And lo and behold, they ended up being, whatever happened behind closed doors with the likes of Donald Trump, if you can imagine what that might look like, not to mention everybody else who was in on it that we're seeing through the Epstein files, right? And so, that was your first clue. We're in 2025, people. This has been going on a long time. But what we document in the con is that we show you that liars' loans were used to basically set up tens of millions of people in refinancing houses that they didn't understand they were getting in the midst of, which was getting set up. You've heard of the Big Short? That's definitely part of it, and a very big part of it. Okay. And the idea was that they used this entire housing industry to basically provide liar's loans to people who could never afford to pay back those loans. And then ultimately, when they bankrupted, they shorted them, and then they could basically resell or whatever else, refinance as long as the value of those homes kept going up. And what we show you in the con is that that was part of the con conspiracy as well, where it was a scenario, and this has been around for a long time as well, appraisal fraud and lender fraud, and then of course all of the fraud that took place, that some of which we saw in the Big Short, involving the credit rating agencies, who are also involved with this immense scenario with combining, pensions of school funds and teachers and all sorts of laborers, or I should say the middle class, and also countries around the world and counties and so on and so forth. And they would sell these securities of garbage to set them up, and then they could make money on the shorts. But they also had in their back pocket that they knew that if they destroyed the world economy, that the world would have, meaning the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, no choice but to bail them out. We all talk about bailouts, but nobody understands the full degree of the bailouts. And that's what we lay out here in Federal Reserve 13 Act 3. My friends, we didn't bail out Wall Street to the tune of TARP to $700 billion. We provided $33 trillion illegally in 2009. Do you understand now the disparity in wealth, the wealth gap? Do you understand the affordability crisis? This is why we gave the billionaires who destroyed the world tens of trillions of dollars for free. That created Elon Musk and all of this insanity that we're all in the midst of. And it's all laid out here. And if you look into the right here, a detailed look at the Fed bailout by funding facility and recipient, the illegal actions of the Federal Reserve. This third cell is the most important audio interview with Rajan Cohen of Sullivan and Cromwell that dates back to 2010. That was part of the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission. And he was one of the general partners of Sullivan and Cromwell, who, by the way, created the CIA. And why, of all firms, would be in the position to create the bailouts for what, in his words, were the consortium. And he explains exactly why they did it. And they expanded the credit bubble of Federal Reserve Act 13.3 illegally because they could, and nobody was asking questions. And so they provided $33 trillion in 2009. Then we did another 16 trillion in quantitative easing. Then we did another 19 trillion because of a repo run in 2019. That's $71 trillion before COVID. And there was more during COVID, and there was more during the runs during the Biden administration because of what took place at Silicon Valley Bank and New Republic Bank, because of the run on crypto and also interest rate swaps. But we ended up bailing out the likes of Peter Thiel at Silicon Valley Bank. This happened between three administrations, starting with Obama, going through Trump. Trump basically, I think he let the whole world know what was going on. Not to mention, he was backdooring all sorts of money to his friends like Sheldon Adelson, who had then died, but to save casinos in Las Vegas, which I think you can't get anything more un-American than a casino being bailed out. I'm sorry. I have never been bailed out losing my ass from stupid moves at a casino. So why on earth were we bailing out casinos? That is not the market. That is not capitalism. I know so many of you want to blame capitalism. You need to blame on one, leg of it, predatory capitalism, but it's really what I'm revealing to you is socialism for the criminal class. You need to get that through your head, because I can show you, and I do show you, that the number starts at 71 trillion. That went to about, I don't know, 300,000 individuals. It didn't go to 300 million Americans. It didn't recreate our entire country, which it could have easily done. And the way you have to understand this is we're a fiat currency. Congress has the power of the purse. The dollar's not going anywhere, even though it looks like Trump's trying to do everything in his power with his BRICS colleagues to destroy the dollar. So they might do it sooner than later. But in the midst of all of the other things, from Doge and buying out the Supreme Court and, judicial immunity and so on and so forth, I should say presidential immunity, you guys, can't you see the forest for the trees? And I can tell you, and I started this whole thing off with Bernie Sanders and, he's not telling you the details of this information. He never has. Neither is Elizabeth Warren. AOC is not telling us this information. I really like them. I like them all, that they're playing because they make a Faustian bargain. And young AOC literally was on the floor of Congress a year and a half ago, and she said, RICO is not a crime. Now, many of her, benefactors, not benefactors, but people that are on her side, were making excuses that were saying, she was saying it's all about the predicate acts that create RICO. RICO is the mother of all crimes. She's not an expert in RICO. And you would want somebody potentially running for president to actually know what racketeering is, but AOC doesn't, and she's not interested in learning this. Everybody is basically trying to protect the status quo just so they can get their piece of it. And that goes for Democrats. And we're at a section now where, you can't play both sides. It's all or nothing. I know if we've seen Doge to ICE to creating wars without congressional approval. Congress isn't there. The Supreme Court's not going to hold you accountable. Being able to steal $5 billion in a short period of time. Effectively murdering 600,000 people, mostly children, throughout Africa because of USAID. The list goes on and on and on. America, you have to understand, the Democratic Party has never, since Clinton, been interested in destroying corruption. That's how they get paid. Okay? We got to crush corruption completely. And we need millions upon millions of people to do it. And so the precepts of the Clean New Deal, I'll just go through them briefly, is there's 4 questions we have to ask that I think really illustrate what we've become and what we're truly all about. And this, I don't believe, in the 250-year evolution of the United States should be where we are. I don't think it was the intent of the founding fathers, although there should be some argument that there are maybe elements, but let's just think about this clearly, right? So what is qualified immunity? Briefly, qualified immunity is that the police can shoot to kill and not be held accountable. That must end. I'm not saying that the police should not be able to shoot to kill. They should have been able to shoot to kill during the January 6th insurrection in a much larger degree than they did, in fact. But at the same time, that would have been in defense of the Capitol, right? They were defending the Capitol, and they were, meeting a surge of, basically Confederates, and they were trying to destroy the rule of law, and they did because they won, because they didn't shoot back, and because of all things Donald Trump at that time. The only thing he did, he was never the mastermind, but he was just the right person at the right place because he is president at that time to be able to stand down the National Guard, of course. And we've seen the National Guard deployed in Los Angeles and ICE and all of these other things, to, chase out brown people and destroy habeas corpus and due process and everything else. So what is judicial immunity? Judicial immunity, think about this. Supreme Court being completely corrupt, crowning Donald Trump the king, cannot be held accountable. And we know that they've gotten billions of dollars of influence through all sorts of people like, I don't want to say Alito is on the receiving end of this, of course, because of the relationship with Opus Dei. And I'm trying to think of the billionaire hedge fund Leonard Leo, who's behind that, thanks to the work of ProPublica, and I should say of not the Intercept, I'm so sorry, The Lever, David Soros, The Lever. And then, of course, presidential immunity. I mean, a guy who deferred military service because of some bullshit, bullshit story about his bone spurs, and he was, a rich kid that went to a military school that failed his way through Wharton, and then he ends up. I mean, this is just the consequence of the impunity of the so-called rich that can buy their way through anything, and the law doesn't hold them accountable. All 3 of these elements are just the antithesis of the law being supreme. And in the final cell, you'll see what is the Electoral College. It's the methodology by which the minority can control the majority because of manipulation of things in the shadow, like Donald Trump did in 2020. That got thrown out in Fulton County, Georgia, because of the racketeering enterprise to basically use electoral certification slate fraudulently to steal the election. And they did that in 6 swing states. Okay, that plus billionaires in small states have much more influence than an entire big state like California. It's ridiculous. These are the questions that you've got to ask about the perversion of power, right? How many of you have thought about priests raping children, does that confound your notion of the integrity of the church and your belief in God, right? What God who believes in eternal damnation would allow, for example, those who are the hierarchy of the establishment that celebrate all things God's message to basically rape its children? I mean, therein lies a major problem, i.e., the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. I use a lot of biblical references, but it's just mankind, in this grand cacophony of space, this weird, flawed scenario where you can't trust people really. I think there's more good people than bad people, but I do believe that we have two columns of our soul. On one side, we have character, integrity, and decency, and dignity, versus complicity, duplicity, and complicity and conformity. Where you go is based on your fortitude and your courage and your commitment to character. Character is what it's all about. But if you have a system of law where people who are in positions that have character, have been vetted out, don't lie, steal, cheat, and deceive, when they're in positions of power, they hold power to account. But since all of this stuff is happening, what's your first sort of reaction? They're all liars. This whole system depends on lies. We're swimming in an ocean of madness and lies that's been 4 decades in the making, that involves 9/11, that involves 25 years of war on terror, which is basically further entrenching the military industrial financial fossil fuel complex that basically is criminal in nature. How many of you understand the petro state? They're mostly villains, right? I mean, that's just what Donald Trump has said about, what we've just done in Venezuela, did he not? But of course, he let, the president of Honduras get out because of whatever happened behind the scenes there. And he's also, of course, least we forget, blaming No Kings as being, and this came from Stephen Miller, the White House chief of staff, as well as, everybody from, you know, uh, Nazi Barbie, in Homeland Security, and really Caroline Levitt, the spokesperson, media spokesperson for the White House, and everybody else were calling, you know, everybody who was basically standing for the law and liberty and justice for all terrorists. Meanwhile, of course, he's playing ball with Qatar, UAE, announcing that we're going to have a privatized Air Force in Idaho, not to mention taking $2 billion in a 747. I mean, you'd have to be so stupid and so ridiculously cowardly to accept these situations. And it's getting worse by the day. They're going to turn the guns on us. There's no question about it. Whether we've been waiting for it and I've been looking for it, since No Kings and everything else. What do we call it when you have the military completely control the streets and that sort of thing? It will come to me in a minute. I know you all know it, but how are we going to break this system? I mean, we are in dire straits. We're in a straitjacket of the worst of the worst of the last, I don't know, millennium, quite frankly. And it's because of greed. It's because of unaccountability, because greed might be the impetus, but if they break the law, they're supposed to go to jail. That's how you hold greed to account. We haven't done that for decades. We created tens of millions of liars loans that got into the system, that became tens of millions of liars derivatives, that created trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of lies that blew up the world economy. And then we gave trillions of dollars of real money to the system that did it. What did we think was going to happen? So the way out of this business is you've got to put it all together to create the Rubik's Cube where all the sides come together and you have a eureka moment of, oh my God, there is a way out of this. We've got to recreate a modern day Glass-Steagall Act to separate commercial banking from investment banking, but ensuring the full faith and credit of the United States can never again be used to guarantee global financial fraud and racketeering. Every single Democrat would say that, but they're not telling you what I am. That means they've been lying about it or they're unaware, which makes them stupid and incompetent. And I don't believe they're stupid and incompetent. Everybody's playing a game. We have to cleanse the system now because it's going to destroy us completely if we don't. We cannot give tens of trillions of dollars to a global racketeering enterprise for blowing up the world through racketeering. All the bad guys need to go to jail. All the bad guys have to have their wealth completely pulled back, and we have to forge a new commitment to the American people of by and for the people. When we started this journey, if you watch the Forward 13 Waking Up the American Dream, you'll see the first things that I said was, how did we go of by and for the country or the people to of by and for the corruption? Or we said at that time, I should say, corporation, but later to discover it was the corruption that created the corporation. And I said at the very beginning of Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, which set the table for everything, I said, I'm not expendable. Chances are you're not either. If you believe that, and if you're a social justice warrior and you believe in integrity and liberty and justice for all, the only way we can do this is together, and you have to get on board and become a nuclear reaction vector to the big bang of truth I'm dropping. And this is how we got to end Citizens United. Legalized corruption by dark money must end. Just ask the victims of what was happening in the shadows of a freak off at a P. Diddy party. It's not fun to get trained. Not speaking from experience, I told you I avoided that party, and it was more because I was stuck at another party that I didn't go, and thank God I didn't. Oh my God, when I thought about all this stuff, I used to use all this rape and pillage stuff as metaphors. I didn't know it was literal, honestly, until like the last several years. So none of you can ignore what it is that I'm telling you. So those are two sides of the same coin. New Glass-Steagall Act, where we don't give the full faith and credit of the United States to criminals, and we end dark money in politics, so they can't buy the Supreme Court. They can't buy Congress. They can't buy, we'll talk about the media, but they can't talk about, they can't buy, the Senate. I mean, Jesus freaking Christ. Then we've got to demonstrate to all of you who want Medicare for all, that all of you who want a new renewable energy paradigm, you have to understand fiat currency. You have to understand productive capacity. You have to understand that they've already stolen for a very tiny percentage of the population, $71 trillion. It's not a question of where the money is going to come from. We know how to do that. It's a question of making it happen by the collective will of the American people to put the right people in Congress to use the law and Congress to do what it was designed to do on behalf of the American people. We got to recreate the middle class. The only way we can do that is we have to turn the table on fossil fuel. Is it like a heroin overdose to where you can obviously get clean overnight? No, it's going to be a process, and we can't get rid of all of fossil fuel right away. There's got to be a smart way to do this, but we have incredible infrastructure capacity. We have incredible technology through renewables, and most notably, hydrogen is one that I've known about for a long time, of which I've show you in Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream. And, it would create a new middle class. It would create the new capacity. We have to reinvest in regulation, reinvest in holding crime to account. And the only way we can do that is to expand SCOTUS to 13 justices to enforce a canon of ethics and legality to make the corrupt perpetrators accountable to the law. We got to turn the tables on the Roberts Court. And we end qualified immunity, judicial immunity, presidential immunity, the Electoral College, and then finally institute term limits for U.S. senators and representatives and prohibit all insider trading for all members of the Senate, House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, administrations, cabinet members, and we're good to go. Nothing is impossible. Everything is possible, even the worst possibilities. Guys, it's all about common sense. It's all about will. It's all about people of the light coming together to overcome people of the darkness. It's every movie you've seen your entire life. If you're not on the side of Darth Vader, even though you might be able to understand some of Darth Vader's impetus, you're on our side. What I'm providing you is literally, and I'm going to pull this off my screen so I can make my closing argument much longer than I anticipated today, but I want to do it all the time, as we're moving forward to hopefully light a fire under your ass. I mean, what I'm providing you is the Ark of the Covenant, because quite frankly, they're all looking in the wrong place. I'm providing you the Rosetta Stone. I'm providing you oh God, what is the goblet that Jesus drank from? I'm so sorry. I can't remember that one. But, it's just that thing that enlightens everybody. And like I said, one of my calls to action is when you become a nuclear reaction force to the Big Bang of truth that we're dropping, you're practicing the universal truth, the construct of cosmology. Light overcomes darkness with the power of the supernova, which is energy. So we've got to come together. We've got to find people to run for Congress. We've got to find people to speak the same language and look around today, tomorrow, the next day, and every day after. Put what I'm saying up against everybody else. Check out my film Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream. Read through the entirety of the Clean New Deal that you'll find at Patrick Lovell Presents thecleannewdeal.org. Take a look at the trailers that I put for the con season 1 and season 2, and just understand literally that everything from Epstein to all things what's happened with Letitia James at the state AG, to Lisa Cook at the Department of Justice, to SCOTUS, to the Federal Reserve, to Russia, to Deutsche Bank, to JP Morgan Chase, to all things Donald Trump, and many more that I haven't brought. Well, John Paulson. Oh my God, John Paulson is such a huge factor of this whole thing, not to be confused with Hank Paulson, who's another huge factor of this whole thing. It's all the same story. And it's all the same story that's been now going on most of our lives, and a lot longer than most of you have been alive. We had a chance to turn the table on all this stuff in the late 90s. We really did. And then 9/11 happened and the whole world followed. 9/11, 2008, COVID for whatever that was, and then all things Trump 1 and all things Trump 2. And I'll just say this, for those of you who are kind of itching for Kamala Harris or uh, Barack Obama to be our saviors, they allowed this to happen. They didn't create it, but they played ball, and that's why they were able to be in the positions that they were. And Kamala Harris failed us by not being the prosecutor versus the felon. She wanted to etch a sketch all of this stuff that I'm talking about. She wanted to basically be hope and joy we can believe in part two, hope and change we can believe in part two. And I, conflated those things because didn't Kamala Harris say, it's joy, right? Look, I just want you to forget about it. Basically, it's like a divorce. We got to move on. Give us the presidency. We'll take care of this. We'll figure everything out. No, you won't. You will not, my friends. You don't defeat cancer by ignoring the tumor. You got to blast it with chemo. The truth is chemo. So thank you for listening. I hope you'll share far and wide. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Please leave them in the comments section below and explore, discover, become the truth, and become powerful. And like my friend Roseanne Rabiella Mila says, I like to say, when you have the truth, you're bulletproof. She likes to say, when you have the truth, you're drinking from the fountain of youth. Guys, this is biblical. It's the crossroads. We've got to turn the table. The greatest opportunity in the history of the world is now, but only if we all come together to champion the truth. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart. For those of you who tuned in here till the very end, I really deeply appreciate it. I look forward to your comments. All the best.